Hi everyone, Joe Kral, President of the Society of St. Sebastian, and again, welcome to Pro-Life University. And just to let you all know, if you've been enjoying this, be sure to always give us a big thumbs up. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. And if you ever have any comments or questions, don't hesitate to write something down below, and I'll be glad to get back with you as best as I can. Today's topic, we're going to talk a little bit about the protection of in vitro fertilization embryos, especially when it comes to custody disputes within divorce cases. There's been a lot of things that have been going on over the decades since in vitro fertilization has become a reality. Most recently, the Connecticut Supreme Court ruled that embryonic children can in fact be considered marital property. And this is really kind of a big problem, and this is where the pro-life movement really needs to step in, because one, we cherish all human life from the moment of conception. So the mere fact that an embryonic child can be considered as property should be horrifying. Just as horrifying in many ways, morally speaking, as slavery. We can't ever consider human beings as property. It's morally problematic, because human beings being made in the image and likeness of God, in the imago Dei, so to speak, that poses a huge problem, because every human being has an immeasurable amount of dignity about them, and so we can't consider them property. There's something very different. They're persons. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. Let's first talk about that Connecticut case. It came down last week, and as I mentioned in the last video, it basically ruled that in vitro fertilization embryonic children that are in a dispute between divorcing parents, especially parents where one parent wants to keep the children and another parent wants to have the children destroyed, are considered marital property in that state now. Well, that's a major problem. But the big thing to know here is that this is not a unique sort of situation. This sort of thing has been happening around the country pretty consistently for over 30 years. And so we need to recognize, as a pro-life movement, we need to step in. It's very important to step in and do something about these situations, because typically what happens within the courts is that the court rules in favor of the parent that wants to destroy the child. That's a problem. Secondly, it's kind of odd when we describe the children, the embryonic children, as marital property, but we treat property within the marriage with more respect than we do the embryonic children. Typically speaking, the divorcing couple doesn't, destroy marital property. They might sell marital property, such as a home, and then, split evenly the assets of that home. But they don't destroy it. And here again, we see more respect being paid to furniture than we are being paid to these embryonic children. And so that's certainly a huge, huge problem, right? And it certainly needs to be addressed. And so I'm really trying to urge pro-life advocates to urge pro-life organizations to really come in and start promoting legislation that promotes the dignity and helps protect the lives of these embryonic children. Now, one of the things that typically comes up, especially me, and as someone who has taught ethics, has taught theology, one of the common questions I certainly get is, are embryonic children really persons? And I think we need to approach it from a scientific standpoint, and then we can look at a metaphysical, philosophical standpoint, if you will. Scientifically speaking, when we talk about the embryonic child, we know it's a genetic human being. It's an individual member of the species Homo sapiens, without a doubt. If you were to test it, you would see that it's an individual member of the species Homo sapiens. It's not going to be a dog. It's certainly not any other sort of animal out there or plant or anything. It's genetically human. So certainly from a physical and a scientific standpoint, we see this as an individual member of the species Homo sapiens. It's not, this embryonic child is not his mother nor his father. And so we need to recognize right away that this is a unique human individual. So scientifically speaking, that's where we are there. Now, if we look at it from more of a philosophical / metaphysical perspective, we can go back to one great Christian philosopher by the name of Boethius, and he defines person as a substance or an individual substance of a rational nature. Now, let's be clear here, all right? When Boethius is talking about this, he's not talking about the ability to use reason in the here and now. So, for example, all right, he would still argue that a person who's in deep sleep is still an individual substance of a rational nature, right? He would still argue, for example, someone who is in a coma is still a substance, an individual substance of a rational nature. So this is an important sort of thing to bear in mind here. The immediate ability to think doesn't necessarily qualify a human being from not being a person. So when people argue, well, the embryo can't think, well, that might be scientifically accurate, but from a philosophical perspective, it's still a substance, an individual substance of a rational nature. Right? Just because it doesn't have the ability to think right then and there, right, doesn't dismiss what it actually is. The human being, uniquely, when it comes to all of physical creation, has this ability to understand reason, has the ability to have free will, and so forth. And so even this tiny embryo, even though it's not able to actualize those things in that immediate moment, will be able to actualize those things later on. So I think it's important to note that, yes, indeed, at the moment of conception, when you have a zygote, which is the earliest stage of embryo, you indeed have a unique human person, right, that's deserving of rights and so forth. Now, one of the other things that we need to look at is obviously the issue of incrementalism here, because in many ways, much like the pro-life movement has to approach abortion in an incremental method, we too are going to have to approach in vitro fertilization and the various evils that have flowed from basically in vitro fertilization. We're going to have to approach that from an incremental method as well. So let's talk about incrementalism here real quick. All right. Now, incrementalism, as you know, and I've said this in past videos before, when we talk about incrementalism, this is something that is firmly established by St. John Paul II in his encyclical, The Gospel of Life, otherwise known as Evangelium Vitae. And in his encyclical, particularly in section or number 73, he lists the three elements to the principle of incrementalism. First, there's got to be an already existing evil law. Secondly, the proposal must limit the harm of the already existing evil law. And thirdly, it has to help move public morality from the general acceptance of the evil law. So those are the three things that we got to look at when it comes to incremental legislation. What's it going to do? How's it going to limit the harm? How's it going to help people move away from the general acceptance that killing embryos is a good thing, right? So let's first start with the first element here, the already existing evil law. Now, IVF in many ways is unique because what's going on here, and certainly in our system, it's really kind of an unwritten law. There's no law prohibiting it. And as a result, you have something that many legal scholars will call tacit qui concert. Tacit qui concert. I can't pronounce it in Latin today. You have to forgive me. It basically means silence implies consent, right? And so the very idea is that since the law is silent on it, it's permissible. And so this is a very important point here. So we literally have an unwritten law that allows this sort of thing to happen. So it allows the creation of these embryos, and it certainly allows the destruction of these embryos for any reason. Right? Whether that's research, whether that's a divorce dispute, whether that's just because you don't want them anymore, or just because, nothing is stopping you from destroying these embryonic children. So that's certainly an evil within the law right then and there. Right? So let's look at a proposal right now that would limit the harm. Right? And again, I think Arizona's Senate Bill 1393, which was passed and signed into law in 2018, really provides an excellent model for other pro-life organizations around the country to look at that can help address the harm, especially when it comes to divorce disputes. All right, now, one of the things that we got to remember is that we're limiting the harm. It's not going to completely abolish in vitro fertilization. We first and fundamentally need to understand that. We're limiting the harm. We're doing this in an incremental way. So what the Arizona law did was, when there was this dispute that came about between a husband and wife that were divorcing and there were these embryos that were involved, it basically said, well, the person or the spouse that wants to keep the embryos can keep the embryos, and the spouse that doesn't want the embryos can have their parental rights basically dismissed, meaning they're no longer have any sort of legal obligation to those children. Right? Now, I think in many ways this is kind of an ingenious way to kind of address the situation, because one of the things that we really fundamentally need to realize is that when couples come in and they're going through the process of in vitro fertilization, they usually sign a contract that says in cases of death or divorce, the embryonic children can be destroyed. And then later, that one or even both spouses can have a change of heart, meaning that they don't want them destroyed. And so I think it's important to note, the law sort of recognizes that that sort of thing can definitely happen. And again, I think it definitely helps limit the harm in these divorce proceedings from these embryonic children basically being, being killed because one parent doesn't want them anymore. And so I think it's important in that aspect, at least from a moral aspect when we look at it. It's important to note that it's definitely limiting the harm in these circumstances, that in cases in Arizona now where embryonic children are in dispute, one parent wants them destroyed, one parent wants to keep them, those embryonic children can now be saved. And I think that's an important little step here, right? Again, it's incremental, right? Now, this gets into the third element of the principle of incrementalism, which is basically how's it moving public opinion away from this general acceptance of the evil law? Well, one, it certainly states that there is a value that wasn't there before with respect to these embryonic children. Right? I think that's definitely important. We got to remember, there are parents out there that begin to realize that these embryonic children are not just mere things. They're not just mere commodities. They're not just mere objects. They're not just mere things that you can flush down a toilet, so to speak. But indeed, that they are really human beings that deserve protection by a parent. And so I think this law certainly helps that parent do the parental duty. So in many ways, we could also add, if we will, this idea that it helps restore parental duties. It helps restore what's called in ethics the principle of subsidiarity, where the parent can actually protect his kid or his children from an abusive parent. And obviously, in this particular case, the abusive parent would be the parent that wants them destroyed. So a parent certainly has that duty to protect their children from an abusive parent. And I think it also helps people see that in many ways, that these are not just mere objects that can be just merely thrown away, if you will. Right? Well, again, guys, I really appreciate everything that you do, watching us and passing this along and so forth. And again, if you ever have any questions, don't hesitate to comment below. Give us a big thumbs up. We appreciate everything that you do, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and God bless.